My name is Deni Elliott, and I hold the Eleanor Poynter Jamison Chair in Media Ethics and Press Policy at the University of South Florida. I finished my doctoral work in 1984, so I've been teaching ethics, and I finished my doctoral work in 1984, so I've been teaching ethics for a long time. I started off as an assistant professor at Utah State University, and then took a year-long fellowship at Dartmouth College. Was tenured at Utah State University a couple of years later, and then I went to
Montana?
Yeah, thank you.
I've known you a long time.
Right. I went from Dartmouth, where I was a Rockefeller Fellow for Professional Ethics, and then the first full-time director for the Ethics Institute at Dartmouth College. And Pat Werhane was in that next year of Rockefeller Fellows. And then I went to the University of Montana as the Mansfield Professor of Ethics and Public Affairs and Professor in the Philosophy Department. And then I went from Montana to the University of South Florida and switched to a journalism department. But I've been teaching in departments of journalism, in departments of philosophy, and in departments of education since I came out of Harvard, and have been tenured in two of the three.
So your degree is from Harvard, yes?
Yes. I have an EDD in philosophy of education from Harvard, even to make things weirder.
How did you get interested in teaching ethics? What is it that prompted you to head down this path?
My interest in ethics developed probably because I grew up in Washington, D.C. during the era of civil rights and Vietnam anti-war work. I was only 9 when Martin Luther King came to D.C. for the March on Washington, and I really wanted to go, and my parents were apolitical. But they told me if I could find responsible adults, I could go. So I went door to door in my neighborhood and met some folks who were going to the March on Washington, and they took me to that and basically to lots of civil rights work and anti-war work after that. And so by the time I got through high school, college, I really felt like I could change the world. I mean, we had, with the civil rights work and ending the Vietnam War. So I always had this feeling that I was supposed to change the world and work with other people who had those kinds of lofty ambitions. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with my academic work. I started off at the University of Maryland with an undergraduate degree in classical rhetorical theory and a minor in journalism. And I remember my mentor, Kathleen Hall Jamison, saying to me that if Aristotle were editor, I could find a job. But as it was, I did some work for a while, but then I did a master's degree in philosophy and realized that I had found my home, that philosophy spoke to me the way nothing else had. And it helped me understand the bad things that people did, and it helped me understand the greatness that people could achieve. And I decided that I wanted to help other people see that. So I decided I wanted to teach ethics. I remember when I went to Harvard to do my doctoral work, and I went to Harvard to do my doctoral work, and I considered that a happy accident. I was a working class kid, never had any idea that I could go to a school that elite. And basically through professors in my master's degree program in philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit, I connected with Professor Israel Scheffler at Harvard, and he asked me where I was going to do my terminal degree. I told him I didn't know because I was interested in social institutions like journalism and government and education, but I couldn't find some place that would let me study that theoretically. And he said, well, I take a student or two a year. If you can get admitted, I'd like you to be my student. And of course, now I understand that him wanting me there is what got me admitted. So I was so fortunate to go to Harvard and do my work and come out with this degree in philosophy of education. But I worked with Israel Scheffler, I worked with Larry Kohlberg, I worked with Carol Gilligan, I worked with Cicely Bach, and I worked with Marty Linsky and Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. Those were my mentors. And of course, an incredible array of other students. I was elected to the Harvard Educational Review, which gave me another opportunity to understand work in the field that I wouldn't have just on my own. But when I finished that degree, I thought, I can be rejected by 3 departments in any one university because of my work in education, my work in philosophy, my work in journalism. And indeed I was in the job application process. But I've also been lucky enough to be affiliated with all 3 different degree programs and to work with students and faculty, not just in journalism, education, and philosophy, but people who come with passions from all different fields.
Deni, we're here at the meeting of the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, and you were instrumental in bringing that organization to life. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that came about and what ABBY meant to you at the beginning and what it might mean for all of us in the future?
When I was at Dartmouth as the first director of the Ethics Institute there, I was privileged to work with Bernie Gert and Chuck Culver and Ron Green and Jim Moore, Dan Clauser, some of the real pioneers in this field. And in the late 80s, there was a small consortium of people from around the country who came together at Indiana University at the invitation of David Smith to talk about creating an organization that would promote the work in, I think what was then called applied ethics. I never liked that term. When I was working on my master's degree, the professors I worked with generally had the belief that if you were a true philosopher, you didn't do applied ethics. That was something that was just not serious philosophy. And based on my mentors, Socrates and Aristotle, I beg to differ. They did philosophy on the streets, and that's where I wanted to do philosophy, and that's where I wanted to do ethics. So this group that came together at Indiana University for our initial meeting about forming a new national association, what was that national association, were people who believed in that idea. Cicely Bach was part of the group, and she had been my mentor in graduate school. Dan Callahan, who I knew from my work at the Hastings Center, and I think Art Kaplan was there too. But again, it was a gathering of just really great people who I wanted to be when I grew up. So we talked about how the American Philosophical Association just wasn't doing enough, that we needed an organization. We needed an organization that helped students and young faculty feel like their work in ethics had meaning. And now, so many years later, it just seems silly to think that anyone could say that work in ethics was unimportant. It seems to me today that our society has grown to the point of understanding that we're surrounded by ethical issues and we need ethical expertise, whether we're talking about medical care or climate change or who's in government and representing the people. It wasn't accidental that API formed at the time that it did. There was initial interest in ethics, mostly from the federal government. NSF, NIH were both putting money into grants for people doing work in ethics, as was the Department of Education. And the folks who were initially involved, and I'm thinking Amy Gutman, Dennis Thompson, Cecil Bach, Dan Callahan, and soon after, Mike Pritchard, Elaine Engelhardt, Pat Warhane, who's been involved forever.
I don't remember what I was doing.
The people who were initially involved were usually engaged in a grant. I'm thinking that we came together through grants and seminars and symposiums and teaching ethics workshops at the Hastings Center. And we had an opportunity to both get some funding to support the work that we were doing and to support one another in the process. I remember my first job out of graduate school was in the school of, my first job out of graduate school was in the Department of Mass Communication. And it was a fine department, but I was the only one in the department who taught ethics. I was the only one in the department who was researching in that field. And so I felt like my colleagues were all around the country. And API gave us an opportunity to come together once a year, beginning in 1991, I guess was the first year. And I'm thinking that the first year was at the University of Maryland. I remember I remember that meeting, which was quite small but quite lovely. Our first exhibition room was the second year. I know that because I started that exhibition room. And I remember the year we had 68 publishers present here, which was a very big deal. And of course, now in the era of digital communication, there's less call for books than there used to be. But the opportunity to come together as people who really understood what the other was doing and who could review each other's work and provide credible feedback was something that APPE did. And then, of course, the Ethics Bowl, which started later in the mid-90s, I believe, when it first became a national competition. That was a way of bringing students and younger people into the fold.
And when, also, talk a little bit about, because one of the things API does is get together associations, so you have directors of ethics institutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very unusual, I think. And I don't know when that started. But I don't know if you know either. But I think it's just an important thing to highlight because I think no one who's spoken yet has highlighted that idea.
No, so you have these special intersections. You have
Mm-hmm.
journalism and research and...
Yes, but these are the
right.
directors,
right.
That's unusual.
Right, that is unusual. Right.
Yes. I don't know. Can you speak to that?
One of the things that Dennis Thompson and I always have playfully argued about is whether Dartmouth had the first ethics institute or whether Harvard had the first ethics institute. And in fact, when I was at Dartmouth as the director and he was the director at Harvard, we used to have what we called the Harvard-Dartmouth mixer. And once again, we'd bring our fellows together for a day of just good thinking. There weren't many ethics institutes or ethics centers around in the late 80s, early 90s. But once API began meeting on a regular basis, The ethics directors became a group within themselves. Universities were starting centers. Princeton had a center very early, and Amy Gutman was the director of that one. And every year there seemed to be 3 or 4 more ethics center directors. Over the years, that developed from the informal group of let's get together at the bar and talk about the problems of having no money and trying to run an ethics center to a summit that happens pre-conference with the AFI meetings. It's really unusual, I think, for an academic association to recognize and support administrators in the area. But I think that one of the things that makes ethics special in higher education is this feeling that we're all in this together. And over the years, as ethics degrees have been created and ethics certificates have been created, one of the things that's remained has been interest and support that people in the field offer to one another and that we offer cross-discipline. That's one of the other nice things about ethics. You don't have to be a philosopher to do it. I think it's good to have a philosopher around, of course, but people can do ethics from any walk of life. And that's the point that we want to make, is every one of us has the power and responsibility to change the world, and that's what doing ethics is.
I love that theme that I hear you establishing. We are capable of changing the world, and we can, right? That sort of empowerment.
We should.
And we should. Can you talk a little bit about how your research, your work, your teaching may have impacted people to change the world in some way? And when you think about your career, some of the early challenges and maybe some of the future challenges that you see for all of us who want to change the world.
Gretchen, you ask such big questions, and I get this far, and then I go, what else did she want?
Sorry.
So, no, it's okay. I just, I'm sure I'm not going to cover all that.
Okay. That's right. The idea is to just kind of get you started on the path, and not necessarily to cover the whole thing. At least that's my thought.
I've been accused of doing ethics to anything that moves. Over my career, I've published 9 books. I'm working on my 10th. And more than 200 articles and book chapters and pieces that have appeared in the trade press and so on. I'd say about 50% of my work is related to ethics in media or ethics in communication. But I've also have a couple of books out in ethics in fundraising, a couple of books in ethics in research. And right now I'm working on a book on guide dog relationships and ethical cross-species relationships. So I've been all over the place. But I think that my most important work has been work on the teaching of ethics. When I was at the University of Montana, I was fortunate enough to get a grant from Department of Education, from the FIPSE program, to start the nation's first graduate degree program in teaching ethics. And that was an MA in philosophy with a teaching ethics emphasis. And the program only lasted, unfortunately, for 4 or 5 years before I went on to another position. But in those 4 or 5 years, we had about 3 dozen students, graduate students, come through the program. And they came from all walks of life. There were military guys and people from medical schools and people in other forms of science. And we actually even had a mathematician one year, which I found really interesting. But people came from different academic areas wanting to teach ethics well in their particular fields. And over the years, I have watched students who have come through that program just do amazing things. Publish an article in a military journal comes to mind about how unethical it is to have a bloodless war, or a war where soldiers are out of danger, but causing, of course, great destruction and harm. I have students who finish their PhDs and are just doing tremendous work in the field now, and that's been wonderful to watch.
What about the future, Deni?
I know. What about the future?
What about the future?
The future of API, the future of ethics, the future of...
Let's start with one and then maybe talk about that.
What is the future of ethics and particularly in the academic world and how it relates to practice? Do you think we're going to become obsolete?
Sure. Early in my career, it occurred to me that ethics was becoming of interest in the 80s, 90s, not just because of technology, although that was a big factor, but also because at least American society had grown past the point of just trusting that our leaders would do the right thing. Aside from, of course, the devastation we saw worldwide with World War II, we had the McCarthy hearings in the 50s. We had, of course, civil rights and Vietnam War. And I think that regular people were not trusting leaders so much. They felt like they needed to figure things out, which I think is very healthy for a democracy. And over the years, I think we've entered into a period of what Kohlberg would call severe relativism, in that people are still trying to figure it out on their own, but they're struggling. And it's easy to notice bad people doing bad things, and much harder to notice in today's society with social media and instantaneous communication of generally bad things, or kittens, when good people are doing good things. And I'd like to think that we are evolving as a people, as a species, and to a point where we can begin taking better care of ourselves and our world. Otherwise, we're not going to have a world to take care of. So that's...
So how do you see API then participating in that sort of those ideas? And what is the future for API, do you think? Or futures, maybe it's plural. How do you see API evolving?
I think that ethics education in higher education is more important now than it's ever been before, because more students are doing post-secondary work of one sort or another. And I think that ethics education provides an opportunity for people who come from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds to recognize that they share a common belief system. And when students recognize that they share a common belief system, then it gets safe to disagree about the little things. I see API as being more important in its next 30 years than it was in its first 30 years. It's important because API provides the opportunity for people who do this really important work to come together, and learn from one another. I think that API needs to enter the digital era, and there are many things that we can do as an organization online that bring people together, as well as our annual meeting.
We talked to you a little bit about what this project is and what we're trying to do. Was there something that you came here specifically to say, or something you want to have recorded as part of this Business Ethics Pioneers project? So, opportunity to make sure we hear whatever it is you came here to tell us.
Well, some of this relates to the great speaker today at lunch, but
She was good.
I think that one of the most virtuous things that we can teach students, teach our children, is how to pay it forward. And I would like to see API be engaged with that, both within academe and in the community at large. How is it that we can take the gifts that we have been given from our mentors and our peers and use that to create a better world for future generations?
Wonderful.
Okay?
Thanks, Deni. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one quick question?
Sure.
Sure.
You've, I noticed in all of the bios of the people going up for being on the board and stuff like that, you have a guy from Tokyo, for instance. What's your relationship outside of America with possible membership?
Oh, well, my last book, Ethics for a Digital Era, was co-authored with Edward Spence, who is an Australian scholar who I met through API, of course. I do some work for the State Department. A couple of years ago, I was in Brunei, for example, doing work on responsible journalism in restrictive environments. I've done some work in Ghana and Gambia. And I've lectured and done workshops around the world. So, again, I do ethics to anything that moves.
Do you find journalism specifically in the last 5 years has come under incredible pressures that haven't existed before?
Right. The practice of journalism has changed substantially from when I started my first underground newspaper in high school to today. And part of the reason that Ethics for a Digital Era is my last media book is because the ethics work in that field needs to be written now by digital natives, by people who get that in a way I don't. The last book that I co-authored with Ed Spence was on the move from analog to digital media. And he and I were in a good position to do that. But now my students come to class and they talk about apps and platforms that I didn't know about and in fact didn't exist until last week. That creates a whole different environment. But what doesn't change is the importance of communicating with one another with integrity and honesty and care.
Deni, I do want to just ask about the journalism question because you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about journalistic ethics, and really we're getting all kinds of questions in the last few years about fake news. Are journalists telling the truth? Did the Wall Street Journal survey leaving out a particular presidential candidate, was that just a gross violation of journalistic ethics? It just seems like there's a lot of conversation about this.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's always been. It's just it hasn't been on the front pages of every paper. So I'd love to just hear you sort of comment on the current state of journalistic ethics and what's the way forward.
A big change in doing journalism in a digital era is that everyone's a publisher, and that has been a change that's a difference in kind, not degree. Just before the dawn of the digital age, we were all worried about corporate ownership of media and news media in particular being limited to a very few people around the world, and whether that was going to cause a kind of censorship, an inability for people to find out what was really going on in our world. Well, now we know what's going on in our world because all you have to do is open the internet and you'll find somebody who had a phone and took a picture, and there it is. So it's all there for us to see. It's all there for us to think about. But not everyone is in a position to be able to interpret and analyze. That takes skills that go way beyond the technical ability of just being able to click a picture or send a text. And so just as back in ancient Greek days, we needed commentators who could tell the populace what was going on with the leaders and tell the leaders what was going on with the people. We still have that need today for folks who can stand a little bit outside of the fray and help those making decisions hear from the powerless, help those who are citizens, sometimes powerless, sometimes not, but help them understand what is being done by their leaders in their name, to help them understand how other people are living. It's the interpretive, analytic, facilitative piece of journalism that we never lose need for.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed.